Soccer Network. Online at NASN.TV.
This is John Strong. You're listening to Soccer Made in Portland.
Welcome Timbers owner and president, Merritt Paulson.
This might take away your Merritt Paulson tweets segment.
No, we already did the Merritt Paulson Twitter update just to make sure we got it in. Garth Lagerway, Real Salt Lake General Manager.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate having me on.
An interview that we did with Kenny Cooper.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for the kind words.
Jim Rylett, he is the Timbers U23 coach.
For whatever reason, you have Kelly there because he's really not very good at what he does.
Opinions, yes. Factual information, that remains to be seen.
That's never stopped us before.
Good Tuesday morning, everybody, and welcome to Soccer Made in Portland. It is December 11th, 2012. Heading towards the end of the year, amazingly. This is Mao speaking. Kelly McLean is here as well with a slightly different look than last week. He told us what it was going to be, and it is now available for your viewing pleasure.
No, it looks the same right now, doesn't it? With the microphone?
Yeah, it was with the microphone.
Yeah, baby.
I'm just curious, what does your family think about your...
They hate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my wife's, not too pleased. I did get a handful of Facebook comments about how apparently my dad back in the day had some wild mustaches. So some family members said I look like my dad with the crazy mustache thing going. But I'm gonna keep it around for a couple of days, I suppose, and then I'll just trim it back to the regular mustache. And maybe finish out the week with that.
Are you going to knock one side off only and go like break it down that much, or are you going to that committed?
That might be a bit too much to do like that right there.
Yeah, that would be ill-advised, I think would be the way to describe that. Well, as I mentioned, this is Soccer Made in Portland. You might have guessed there's not that much for us to talk about today, given what we're talking about right now. We are going to go through some of the roster stuff, a few clarifications and updates just since our last show. It's not exactly breaking news today, since a lot of it came out on Thursday, but we're going to talk about it just a little bit. But briefly, just a couple of notes about NASN, North American Soccer Network, of course, and the site is NASN.TV. NASNradio.com is also a good way to listen. There are some people who are no doubt listening live. The show's replayed later in the week as well. And so if you go to the site, you can get all of the links for downloading the podcast, iTunes or RSS, whatever you like. And, of course, encourage people to go to nasnportland.com, where we've got some articles up from time to time, especially as things sort of evolve over the offseason. We'll kind of have some thoughts about kind of how things are going and where guys will fit in and what we think is kind of happening with the Timbers. So check that out. And two quick days in history. One is directly Timbers related. One is indirectly Timbers related. The direct one is December 11th, 1980, 32 years ago today. Jimmy Kelly actually made his sort of long-awaited return to the Timbers. He had left after the 1976 season and been unable to re-sign with the Timbers due to a dispute with Wolverhampton Wanderers, where he was playing at the time. So he rejoined the team ahead of their first indoor season in 1980. And then the indirect one is on this date in 1973, the NASL awarded franchises to Seattle, Los Angeles, San Jose, and Vancouver. LA was the Aztecs. That name was not chosen in 1996, although nor was the Earthquakes, I guess I should point out, since it was the San Jose Clash to begin with. But sort of the beginning of West Coast major professional soccer in North America. A couple of other clubs were added that year as well, so it wasn't just the West Coast clubs. But that addition of those teams in 73, or the winter of 73 for the 74 season, kind of paved the way for Portland to get a team the following year in the winter of 74-75. And the Timbers were one of a couple of teams to join that year, the following year. So that's sort of the blow up of the NASL from like 8 teams to 20 in 2 years. So anyway, kind of an interesting date. And I have to actually give thanks to the communications director at the Sounders who tweeted that out this morning. about this date in 1973. So that all behind us. Let's talk a little bit about the Timbers. We now have confirmation that Stephen Smith will, in fact, not be back. We kind of assumed that was the case, and that was clarified on Thursday that his contract option was declined. So that sort of fits in with what we thought. The main thing that was kind of up in the air was whether or not Rodney Wallace would re-sign after his contract option was declined. Turns out he did. They did reach an agreement, and the Timbers also re-signed Ryan Kowalik and Jake Gleeson. So let's start with Wallace and kind of what you think about that, and then I want to touch on Gleeson for a moment as well.
Yeah, I think I'm glad they were able to work out a deal, and money was the issue all along with him. He just wasn't worth the contract that he had, and so I think it's good that they're able to keep him around, because I think people want to see more of him as a winger, as an outside mid, and even though there's plenty of competition, he's a good guy, I think, to have there for depth, for pushing whoever might be the starters in that role, for that guy that's creating competition. And who knows, maybe he ends up being one of those guys who's the starter. But in terms of creating that competition that we always hear about from the coaching staff and whatnot, I think it's good that they were able to re-sign him and bring him back. And I mean, he's not the greatest left back we've ever seen, but if you've got him there as a second or a third option in case something happens, it's nice to know that at least he's there in that capacity as well.
Yeah, and look, at the moment, with Smith gone, the left backs that are currently on the roster are Chris Taylor and Rodney Wallace. I mean, I suppose Michael Harrington could end up over there. Obviously, well, not obviously, but we assume they're not done, that they're planning on adding a legit or true left back, if you will. We're going to get back to this in a second too, but Gavin Wilkinson was asked on Extra Time Radio, what about Johnny Bornstein? And to be fair, Robbie Finley, I care less about Robbie Finley in this regard, but kind of, I think hemmed and hawed is a way that you said he was kind of going throughout the whole interview on some level, and he kind of mentioned Bornstein. And so anyway, we think that they're not done, whether that Bornstein's that answer or not. But yeah, it's good to have a guy like Wallace. And I said this in an article on the site, NASN Portland late last week. I think the sort of subtraction part of the Timbers roster makeover is more or less over. I think there will still be some guys who perhaps Mike Facito or I suppose possibly Kris Boyd or whatever. I mean, there are some names that could still depart, but I think for the most part, the sort of exodus of players is past, and I think the rest of what we're going to see is going to come in the form of additions. We know that they're going to be adding some players automatically as far as the draft goes, and we assume through other trades and signings. But I think from here on out, I think the main differences are going to be in sort of in emphasis, less than personnel. So I think we've kind of seen that wave of mass departures. That was sort of Monday of last week, where they got rid of a bunch of guys all at once. And you're just looking at the list of guys whose options were picked up. I mean, and then the guys who are already under contract. I mean, they've got mostly a full roster now. I mean, they've got Wallace and Kowalik and Gleeson and Bendick and Footy and Taylor and Alexander, Al Hassan, Zizo, DK, Richard. I mean, all these guys weren't automatically going to be back, and they chose to bring each of them back. Most of them, I think, were expected. Certainly Richards and DK and Al Hassan, guys like that were expected. Maybe less so with a guy like Taylor or Footy. But I want to talk about Gleeson for a second, because I find it interesting that he didn't have a contract option for this year. He had to be re-signed. His contract was up. And that's not surprising when you talk about Kowalik. He was a supplemental draft pick. Obviously local ties with UP, and I think was pretty impressive. And we've obviously talked about him in the past. But no surprise that they would only sign that guy to a one-year contract. And if he impresses, great, you can re-sign him. If he doesn't, you don't really lose anything by by not having a commitment to him. But it's surprising to me, given the focus during the season, especially when there was the trade for Ricketts and the emphasis put on, well, we think Jake Gleeson is the goalkeeper of the future, and we want him to learn under and sort of study under Donovan Ricketts. They play a similar style, et cetera, et cetera. But at the time, Jake hadn't been playing. He'd been injured. Gavin admitted on Extra Time Radio that he basically had a terrible year. He missed 100 days of training or something like that. He was gone all the time with New Zealand, and he was hurt and didn't even very much play for New Zealand during the year. So I think it's kind of weird when you look back that there was that much emphasis put on a guy for whom they didn't even have a contract for 2013. And not even an option, but nothing. He was just out of contract at the end of the year. And it's a little bit not surprising that they re-signed him, because if they put this much faith in him or emphasis on him, he damn well better be back, you'd think. But I just find that a little bit interesting.
Well, do we know, I don't recall from this time last year, but was his deal, was he re-signed last year, or was he on a 2-year contract from the start of MLS?
That's a good question, and I will look that up as we continue talking.
I suppose if he was on a 2-year deal, then I wouldn't be as surprised that there wasn't an option for that 3rd year or something. But you're right. If it was a situation where this time last year they were saying, hey, we re-signed him, and it was just for a single season with no option and nothing else, that would be curious.
So last year, they didn't clarify. So last year at this time, they announced the re-signing of Troy Perkins and David Horst.
Right.
And then they announced the guys whose options were not picked up. And then they simply said that the club exercised contract options for 16 players, and then just listed them with the other players who were also already under contract. So they didn't specify which players, which of those, of the 22 that they listed at November 28th, 2011, they didn't list. Well, these guys were the ones whose options were picked up, and these were the guys whose contracts extended. I mean, we know some of them, like Diego Chara's on here. He did not have a contract option, so he's not one of them. So yeah, it could be that Jake had a 2-year contract. His original MLS contract was 2 years, but even still, I find it kind of interesting that he technically could have just walked away, or they could have just not re-signed him, which just seems a little bit odd. Other guys I want to talk about, because we sort of saw a couple of lists. Those whose names I just read off were the ones who were not already under contract. The list of guys who are under contract is an unsurprising group for the most part. Jewsbury and Nagbe and Chara. I thought it was interesting that Frank Songo was on that list. I thought he may have been a guy who, at the very least, would have had an option deal for a 2nd year, just because you never know. I mean, they knew nothing going in, and he'd been not a flop, but unsuccessful at a number of clubs in a short period of time going into last year. So I found it a little surprising there, but a couple of names weren't on the lists, and one is Mike Facito, one is Danny Mwanga, and one is Jose Valencia. Now, the latter of those, I think, is easily explained. They had to restructure his deal to be a loan. I'm sure they'll reassess, or not reassess, but whatever they need to do, I think they probably won't be able to do it until January when the transfer window opens, if he was basically just on loan for 2012. But the other two I thought were kind of interesting, and I wonder what you think the deal is. I mean, they're not under contract on some level, because they would have been listed as such, or they're in the process of restructuring, or maybe they had an option that wasn't declined. They didn't decline the option for example, on Facito, but maybe they made him an offer and he didn't want it. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. The one that confuses me a little bit more is the Mwanga one, because we've got this tweet from Merritt Paulson that says should have some good news for release next week on Danny Mwanga. So I don't know. I'm confused. Is the good news that you're gonna be able to bring him back and pay him less money, so you get to keep him? Like, is that the good news, or yeah? I'm a little confused as to exactly what that means and what the situation is for those two players, and how come we haven't heard anything yet? Or yeah, I mean, in what category do they fall into? I mean, is their contract running out? Does it extend and they're trying to renegotiate? Was there an option and they're trying to? I don't know what category those guys fall into right now.
Yeah, and I think it's instructive to look at the first release of players, not the Freddie Braun release, but the announcement that they declined options for Lavelle Palmer and Steve Purdy. It turns out that they also declined options for Steven Smith and Rodney Wallace, but they didn't announce that, not in the initial release. And it was only when Wallace's name popped up on the reentry list that people realized, oh, wait a minute, his option was also declined, and the reason he wasn't listed was basically the difference between we're negotiating with Rodney and we're not negotiating with Steve or Lavelle. And Smith is sort of a different case, which I'm still not sure I completely understand what the story is, but it doesn't matter, I guess, on some level. He's not coming back. So I think we sell these lists, but the fact that they don't include these other guys doesn't mean they're not on those lists. It just means they didn't get published in the initial release. So I think, it's obvious that we'll find out more about both of them, eventually, if not, this week, certainly before March, right? I mean, something will happen in the future that's not exactly going out on a limb, that events will transpire after right now. But it was a little bit interesting to not have that out there. I mean, I think most people expect Facito will be gone. But I also thought Footy Dansu would be gone, and his option was picked up. It doesn't mean he can't be now traded or otherwise disposed of, but he's now, picked up, he's going to be under contract for 2013 with the Timbers unless he's moved somewhere else. So what did you think about that? Because we talked about Footy and both sort of said, yeah, his time has come and gone with the Timbers, and he was practicing with teenagers and guys who were unaffiliated with MLS rosters as opposed to first team players, and yet here he is, in the group with guys like Al Hassan and DK and Alexander, who we expect to play and contribute.
Well, I'm going to stick with sort of what I said last week, which is when you've got a roster of 30 and yet you can only suit up, and start 11 guys each week, you have to have players who are willing to play a secondary role. And I just think they figure that Footy is willing to accept that role, not just do it, but accept it and not be an issue in the locker room, not coming in 3 months into the season and saying, this isn't what I want, I should be playing every day, trade me. That he's a guy who will do that role, and when he's needed, they've got somebody competent who's there. And I think he will be needed at some point. But I also think I think he's probably number 4 on the depth chart when it comes to center backs. I think you're going to see Jean-Baptiste probably slotted in above him to start to get him minutes and get him significant playing time. But, you're going to need that 4th center back at some point during the season for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of injury. Maybe it's because of red card. Maybe it's just because sometimes you have to give a guy a break. He can't start, and play 90 minutes for 34 games, plus U.S. Open Cup, plus friendlies and everything else. So he's going to get to play, but it's not going to be probably that often. And if you can have a guy who's there, who's competent, but will do it and be happy with that role, then that's a key piece. I mean, that's just as good a piece as having, a starter who's, a league all-star. If you've got a guy that you can go to who's dependable and is happy in the locker room and not causing problems, in some ways that's just as valuable as having, your starting 11 quality players. So for me, I mean, and I know last week we talked about it, and you talked about the money issue with Bruner and trading him away and the cost involved. But I think another big component is just the fact that Footy is probably a guy who's willing to accept that role.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Although I think it's interesting that I think he makes $82,000, which seems a little high for a guy who's basically your fourth guy. And I know that they've got some loyalty to him, and I assume that he's got loyalty to the Timbers, which would explain why he'd be willing to fill that role. I mean, he's the only guy left who was on the Timbers in 2009. And at this point, Bright DK is the only guy who also played all of 2010. I mean, Khalif signed at the very end of the year, played like two or three regular season games in the playoffs, and that was it. I mean, so he counts technically, but he wasn't on really part of the roster for the whole year. So Footy's the one guy who really extends back, and so I'm sure that there's some sort of mutual feeling of I may not get to play a lot, but I don't really want to go somewhere else and start over either.
And I'm getting $80,000.
Yeah, and I'm getting $80,000, and so if that means I have to practice with Christian Desir, okay, fine, that's that's all right. So yeah, well, let's now talk, since we only have a couple of minutes left, about 8 minutes left. Let's talk about what Gavin had to say on Extra Time Radio. We sort of talked about Gleeson a little bit, but I think it was more interesting to make sure we get it in what he had to say. Or what he said sort of around the idea of Kris Boyd and then additional forwards when he was asked.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of, well, like you mentioned earlier, sort of hemmed and hawed. I don't know if that's the right term, but he was very non-committal, I guess. Maybe that's the right term, when it came to Boyd. And, then he tossed out this idea of sort of other forwards in MLS. I think you pointed out, specifically MLS, tested forwards. And then he sort of did the same thing when talking about the goalkeepers and Gleeson as well. Very, I guess, just non-committal, and still that idea that, we expect moves to be made, but, the reality that, some of these guys could still be moved, and maybe we aren't 100% committed to Gleeson and Bendik as the future. It could come down to just sort of hedging his bets a little bit with that idea that anytime you have a chance to upgrade, you're going to take it. And who knows, maybe people have been asking about Gleeson and or Bendik, and maybe they have some options that they might consider guys that are actually upgrades. So, maybe they're just weighing their options and they just don't want to say anything for certain, because you never know when somebody's going to pick up the phone and give you a call and provide you with a player that could be an upgrade in a position. And most of the time, no matter who that player is or how much you like him, if you really think it's an upgrade and it works, you're going to do it. So maybe it comes down to that. But yeah, I don't know. There was just kind of a weird sort of non-committal response regarding those guys.
Yeah, there's a big difference when Gavin goes on Extra Time Radio and when Merritt does it. Merritt usually gives something away a little bit more, and I think Gavin was, I think he even said, especially with Bornstein and Finley, we're going to keep that close to the chest or close to the vest or whatever he said. And they should, right? I mean, they shouldn't just give away state secrets, on the league podcast. That doesn't make any sense. But the other part of it is you hope that they say something that gives you some indication of what they're thinking. And yeah, I thought the goalkeeper stuff was pretty interesting. I mean, the one thing he did sound pretty committed to was the idea that Donovan Ricketts is going to be the goalkeeper all year, this year in 2013, and we know he's under contract for the rest of 2013. And sort of like Kris Boyd in a way, a little different, but similar in the sense that you're paying these guys a lot of money, and they're under contract, and they're going to get paid, and they can contribute. It's not a situation where Ricketts is completely ineffective or Boyd is completely ineffective. I mean, I don't know if you watched that video of all the goals from the Timbers in 2012 that the league website put up. And it was, I mean, obviously it kind of was in little groups, right? There was like a bunch of Boyd stuff at the beginning and a bunch of DK stuff at the end, and then a bunch of junk in the middle. And it was, I don't know, I just thought it was interesting watching the beginning of that and remembering, because it seems like so much has happened. It's been so long since Kris Boyd scored. But he scored a bunch of the Timbers goals early in the season, and of course they didn't have the one that got called back in LA, which I think was in May. But he scored basically all his goals at the beginning of the year, and you can see these situations popping up where he's sitting there in front of goal, or he's getting shots off, and we've talked about it before, but it just seems like the cost of moving him could be so high. If you know you only have 1 year that you have to worry about, and then if it's still not working, you're under no obligation to continue, and you can only make limited moves in one off season. Why not keep him and try and make it work? And Gavin tried to sort of say, Kris Boyd can play in this system, and he talked about his time at Nottingham Forest playing a 4-3-3. Now I think he played like 9 games at Nottingham Forest, but still, like, he's basically trying to say, yes, it's possible. And to me, it just all sounded like it was just saying, look, Kris Boyd is going to be here, and it may not be the best situation for both, but it's a better situation for both than the alternative, which is for Boyd not playing or for the Timbers paying someone to not play. So
or paying for him to play for somebody else.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of what I took away from that. But I did think it was interesting that he said they were looking for other forwards, considering the run that DK went on, considering that Nagbe could be considered a forward, considering that they potentially have Mwanga, and that they have, he didn't even mention Valencia. And that is presumably somebody that's going to be coming back and getting more time certainly than he did in 2012.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious and waiting to hear what's going to happen with Valencia. Presumably he's got to go through a battery of tests.
I hope so.
And we don't know when that is. I mean, all the guys go through that fitness testing those first couple of days. I wouldn't think they would wait until then to do it. I would think they'd try to see if he could pass all those tests and MRIs and everything else he's going to have to do, sometime in December, so that they know, so that they can move forward, whether or not they're going to, commit to that deal or send him back or not move forward with him. But I'm curious to see what's going to happen with him. We assume that he's going to pass all the required tests, and they're going to be willing to commit to that contract. The same terms that were set up a year ago. It was just sort of delayed for a year, but who knows when we'll actually get confirmation, of that or what. So yeah, I'm waiting to hear about Valencia. Still an intriguing player, a guy I'd love to see out there training with the first team day in and day out. I mean, we've talked about him before on here. He's an imposing presence. He's a big boy. With speed and skill, and it'd be fun to see him out there.
Yeah, he certainly had no problem stealing the ball from Cam Vickers and going in for a shot in his one reserve game appearance. That was tremendous. Well, we're out of time this week for this 30-minute show. Hopefully, we'll have a little bit more to talk about next week. But as we kind of come down towards the end of the calendar year, not too much going on as the holidays set in, and then everybody kind of goes away and then resets come the 1st of January. So, we'll get Caleb Porter coming into town, although not available to the media. So that will be interesting to talk about, I guess. But yeah, until next week, where we'll hopefully have some kind of update on Danny Mwanga, and presumably actually an update also on the women's team and what their name and logo look like. Yep. We're expecting that by the end of this week. So until next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, this is Mao.
And this is Kelly. We'll see you again next week.
Yeah, speak to you then.